Hello, everyone. This is Gary Lovely, the marketing manager at the Book Loft. Super excited here to be joined by Mr. John Dean, who is the author of Authoritarian Nightmare, Trump and His Followers. John was also the White House counsel for Richard Nixon. And we're going to talk a little bit about the book. And then we're also joined here tonight by Edicson Gonzalez. Edison was an intern for Hillary for America and was an alumni for Shawnee State, where he studied political science. I'm going to hop off here and let everybody get started, and thanks so much.
All right. Well, good evening or hello, whatever time of day you're watching this. I've got a brief PowerPoint I'm going to use to get into this book. It's based on academic study presented in a non-academic manner. That was my job as a collaborator. I have been studying this science for a little over a decade and written another earlier book on it, as I'll mention. So my job was to keep my collaborator, Bob Altemeyer, out of his academese and rather to keep it in for a lay audience. Before I get into the book, I discovered a very interesting study done by the Democratic Fund, their voter study group, that is actually an examination of attitudes in America of authoritarianism. And I will define authoritarianism for you. We could spend, I could do a whole book on that subject alone, but I think most people have a pretty good idea what it is. Anyway, Larry Diamond, who is at Stanford, shared this information with me, and it's really fascinating. Of course, Americans are overwhelmingly love their, quote, democracy, but that overwhelming love often masks some really troubling truths. For example, 1 out of 3, and these are recent polls, these are 2020 polls, 1 out of 3 say that a strong leader is a good way to run a country. That's very authoritarian. 1 out of 4 say they'd favor, quote, army rule in America. That couldn't be much more authoritarian. Fewer than half Americans would object to a president acting unilaterally, that should be a typo there, without constitutional or congressional authority. That's pretty authoritarian too. And 41% say it is appropriate for a president to act unilaterally because, quote, a large majority of the American people believe he should act. Now, I don't know if that is because we don't have civic training anymore in America, or people have really gone full authoritarian, but a hefty amount of the population is very authoritarian. They are by disposition, and clearly they are in their thinking. The polling that we did for the book I'm sharing with you tonight draws right out of this material and confirms it in our study as well. Authoritarianism is typically, and this is the Oxford English Dictionary's definition, is the enforcement or advocacy of strict obedience to authority at the expense of personal freedom. We all recognize authoritarian personalities, and that's really what, rather than getting into the various authoritarian systems of government, we try to stay out of that in the book. We believe that most people recognize an authoritarian government, and political scientists will tell you how our democracy is backsliding from democracy towards authoritarianism. What it means to us in doing this book, it's the relationship of followers to leaders. Stripped to its essentials, authoritarianism happens when followers submit too much to the authorities in their life. So what is too much? It's tolerating lying, cheating, and stealing by your leaders. That would certainly be too much in the estimations of many. It's also allowing them to rule in a fashion that undermines democracy. We feel that is too much, but there are all variations and gradations of authoritarian rule. The best work I've ever read on it is Hannah Arendt's The Origins of Totalitarianism. She wasn't making a scientific study. She is a political philosopher and was looking at it based on her observations of what had happened in Germany and Italy. A more recent and much more succinct work on it is Timothy Snyder's On Tyranny, where he just boils it down to its contemporary essence. Either one will steep you deeply into totalitarianism or authoritarianism. My first dive was back in 2006, where I took a look at what was the increasing influence of authoritarian personalities and leaders on the religious right and the conservative movement. I did a book called Conservatives Without Conscience, which had a nice about 6-week run on the New York Times bestseller list. It actually picked up sales again when Donald Trump arrived. But I looked at the basics of it and came to understand the science that exists around these types of personalities. And really, it was the fact that people were ignoring that science when Donald Trump emerged that prompted me to do this book. He is a conspicuous personality, and the only person that was writing about his followers was one very well done piece by Amanda Taub, who was writing for then Vox, VOX, the online magazine. She's today at the New York Times as an explainer and does always a good job. But Amanda did address the rise of authoritarianism in America using a very abbreviated scientific test that really we didn't feel goes very deep into what type of personalities are really attracted to authoritarian personalities. When Trump ran, his opponents immediately called him for what he is, a demagogue. Lindsey Graham was the first to label him that. Ted Cruz, all these guys are now pals, but they certainly called him out for his demagoguery. Even Stephen Hawking said this is a demagogue of the worst sort. The New York Times took the first 6 weeks of Trump's campaign and sifted through all of his campaign rhetoric. And after that, they had a panel of political scientists and psychologists and people who study rhetoric and what have you. And they decided without a doubt that we had a demagogue who was running for president. And now we have one who's in the White House. And after that, they had no hesitation using demagogue in their headlines. It was about that time that I contacted my collaborator who'd helped me considerably on the book, Conservatives Without Conscience. Bob Altmaier has studied religious fundamentalism and authoritarian personalities for about 40 years. He was born in St. Louis and migrated to Canada, not to get out of the Vietnam War, he always assures me, but rather they just made a very attractive offer where he could continue his studies. But he is a Yale undergraduate, Carnegie Mellon graduate in psychology. And he really has established some of the basics of this science. He is one of the foremost authorities on who is and who is not an authoritarian personality, designing some of the studies and the testing methods. So after working with him and his generosity and helping me with Conservatives Without Conscience, I first encouraged him to take his science and do a layman's explanation of it and put it online, which he did. It's been years since I looked at that book, but the last time I looked, he'd had about 750,000 people had downloaded the book. So I did read the book when it was first posted. I was sending a lot of people when I was out book touring to his website, and he liked that exposure. And so I told him that nobody was really covering Trump's followers. Who are these people that are attracted to this demagogue? So I said, Bob, I think we ought to do something about that. I first began, I had a regular column at Justia's Verdict publication. It is primarily legal analysis. I tend to be a little bit more political, often legal as well. And I got him to address Trump supporters back in July of 2017, because I thought, well, nobody is really explaining these people. It was after that that I decided that we needed to do a book. He said, I will count me in. I said, it's your science and you are the expert. What I can do is try to make sure it is a good read. And based on the reviews we're getting, particularly the Amazon reviews, which I like, are wonderful feedback for an author, other than for the spoilers who go in and because they don't like the outcome of the book and will give it 1 star and say it's awful, even though you know they haven't read it or they don't even own the book. The reviews have been overwhelmingly good. It's got, I think, 4.5 or whatever. It's a half point less than the full 5 stars. I think it's 4.6 or something like that. So anyway, but interesting feedback when you read the reviews for an author. In this session, this brief session, let's focus on the 3 types of personalities that are attracted to authoritarian leaders. And they are labeled in social science, social dominators, authoritarian followers, and a unique group called double highs. The social dominators are people who have emerged through, first of all, interviewing and then developing testing a scale that tests their social dominance orientation. These tend to be people who are, to qualify, they have to hit certain criteria. They have dominating type personalities. They believe in inequality. Here I have circled with my pointer George Wallace, if you don't miss him. That's the Deputy Attorney General Katzenbach, when Wallace was famously saying that he would not desegregate schools, kind of an awful example of inequality. But social dominators believe in inequality. They want to be parts of groups that are share that philosophy, or they themselves are espousing inequality. They are also people who are desirous of personal power. I think that that's a example of a leader who certainly personifies a desire for personal power when you start killing your family off to maintain power. They are also people who are amoral. So those qualifications are the keys. They're dominating personalities, they oppose equality, they're desirous of personal power, and amoral. They'll also have other traits that other personality testing gets to. Now, social dominators, you can't test them all. And most of them are, for example, Donald Trump, who is a poster boy for social domination. He's not somebody who's ever going to take this personality test. So what you can do, though, while typographies have their weaknesses, when somebody walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, and looks a lot like a duck, you can be pretty sure it's a duck. So often when you see people who just conspicuously display these personality qualities, you can be pretty sure where they fall. They're big key point kind of tests. You're not doing any kind of medical analysis. Just a personality type is a little different than say a psychological or a psychiatric analysis. It's pretty conspicuous typically. I find we have, when you look over history, we have 4 or 5 now authoritarian presidents who were clearly social dominators. For those of you who don't recognize him, that's John Adams. That is Andrew Jackson. That's Woodrow Wilson. And that's Richard Nixon. And the 5th is our incumbent president. they all certainly show the traits of social domination. So often the typical traits that follow, and this is one of the things that got a lot of public attention when my book came out. When the sales on the former book started picking up, I wondered why, and I talked to people, and they said, well, it was some of the tables you had in there showing the personality traits of people, and they all looked like Donald Trump when you got to looking at the social dominators. So here's a chart that I had in the book that was published back in 2006. Where social dominators typically are intimidating and bullying. They're faintly hedonistic, they're vengeful, they're pitiless, they're exploitive, manipulative, dishonest, they'll cheat to win, highly prejudiced, mean-spirited, militant, and nationalistic. It looked like I was describing Trump, which I was not, because I had no idea he was even going to run for president at that point. But these social dominators are pretty much fools on soapboxes unless they get followers or they're showmen that are on a reality television, and they will pick up their own followers there, but so that they can be good theater. So it really, most of the science of studying authoritarianism has not paid a great deal of attention to the social dominators or the leader types. They are, as I say, pretty conspicuous people. It's the followers that have attracted most of the science. In fact, when I did the book in 2006, just then was the social dominance orientation scale emerging as a good test to find out who were these personalities. And since then, of course, there's been a lot more. But initially, there was not a great deal of. So the study is long of authoritarian followers, and it started because of Hitler and Mussolini, with people wondering if it could happen in the United States what had happened in Italy and Germany, where so much of the population had just been attracted and so willing to fall to the sway of these authoritarian personalities. This resulted in World War II resulted in a group of German Jewish scientists migrating to Berkeley, where they began studying and asking the question, could it happen in the United States what had happened in Italy and Germany? Would it ever happen here? Would people fall for these kind of leaders? The short answer was yes. Their work, which was published in 1951 and started this whole body of science, was dubbed the Authoritarian Personality. And it is a study of followers. The science had its flaws. There was a lot of Freudian psychology. But by 1980, most of the initial science had really been reworked and revised. And that's when you had come up with the test for authoritarian followers, or the right-wing authoritarian scale. Bob Altmaier is one of the key players in the development of that scale, which has been widely tested now and replicated throughout the country. So let's take a look at this scale, because it is very telling. That's more detail than you need. That's actually a page from my book, so I'm going to go to I'll come back to that. These are people who are, the right-wing authoritarian personality is somebody who is submissive to authority. I couldn't find a picture of a person that was submissive, but that's a pretty good example of a creature who's highly submissive to authority. They're also aggressive on behalf of that authority. We've seen a surprising amount of this type of behavior of late, where they find their authority that they like and then become aggressive in its behalf. And they're typically very conventional people. They just look like regular folks, and not particularly would any one of them stand out in a crowd. They are also a third type of a personality, which we'll come back to, is the double high. But let me go back up to this earlier slide I found here and go through this. Since I'm reading it and not putting this up for your observation, I will just share what this list that I have reveals. Because these right-wing authoritarians have been tested and retested for a long time now, for 40, 50 years. These tests have been available, and they have been, there's a pretty good profile of who emerges. While social dominators are almost 99.9% men, right-wing authoritarian followers are both men and women. The keys be they are submissive to authority, aggressive on behalf of that authority, and then very conventional in their life. But they're also found through testing to be highly religious. They have moderate to little education. They trust untrustworthy authorities. They're prejudiced, particularly towards homosexuals, women, and followers of religions other than their own. They're mean-spirited, they're narrow-minded, they're intolerant, they're bullying, they're zealous, they're dogmatic, they're hypocritical, they're uncritical towards their own chosen authority. In fact, in the book, we spend a good bit of time explaining how this happens, how they're able to compartmentalize their thinking, how science doesn't know for certain if it's nature or nurture. Someone like Altmaier, who has been testing these people for 40, 50 years, talking to many of the students and their parents, who are the people he has tested for decade after decade, he's become largely convinced that it is more nurture than nature, that there is a disposition towards this type of personality, and then it's the training. When we wrote the book, we had no idea that Mary Trump was going to do the book she has done, which is something of a psychological profile of her uncle. She's trained in psychology. She's got a PhD and does clinical psychology. But we had already found many of the same sources she did and come to the same conclusion about her uncle that she would, while she wasn't looking for his authoritarianism. Rather, she was trying just to generally explain why he was the way he was. We both reached the same conclusion, that it was from the father, from Fred Trump Sr., and the very negative influence he had on his son, and created the man that he is today. But with the followers, going over to the followers, as I say, they are people who are almost incapable of critical thinking. They don't recognize these traits in themselves. They don't see their inconsistency and contradictory thinking. They don't realize how prone they are to panic. They don't recognize their self-righteousness or moralistic behavior. They don't necessarily realize they are strict disciplinarians and severely punitive. They do demand loyalty, and they return it and have little self-awareness, as I said. So the profile that emerges of these people, it was based on studies that were largely done of college and university student bodies. Before I go on, there is a third type of personality, and it is probably the most troubling of all. And it's somebody who shows traits of both being an authoritarian dominator and being submissive. And they test this way. Social science initially didn't understand how somebody could test high as both an authoritarian dominator, but yet test high as being submissive and aggressive on behalf of the authority, because these are highly inconsistent positions. And what they discovered is that when taking the right-wing authoritarian follower test, the social dominator will take that test and think of themselves as being the leader and how they want people to respond to them if and when they are the leader. Social dominators are quite capable of becoming followers. A classic example of that to me is Mark Meadows, the current chief of staff at the White House. He was clearly a social dominator. He's one of the founders of the Tea Party and then the Freedom Caucus on Congressional Hill. He was a chest pounder and demanded people follow his orders to the T. And yet he gave all that up to become chief of staff and follow somebody who is higher in the pecking order than he is. Now he has to follow orders, and he's no longer the alpha dog. So what explains that? Well, it's because that he's clearly a double high. Double highs can, to get power for themselves, they can become followers, and they do become followers. And this is a particularly dangerous type. When we started this encounter, when writing Conservatives Without Conscience, had discovered a lot of what anecdotally were clearly double highs. Bob Altmaier was always surprised when I told him about all these people. He said, John, science just doesn't really have that many double highs. Well, science didn't have a lot of things we discovered when we decided that we had to put our own science to the test. While Bob wanted to rely primarily on his own studies because he knew their strengths and how he had tried to avoid weaknesses. Because they had been done in university communities, he thought it best we test them wide and broad. Monmouth University's Polling Institute is one of the foremost in the United States today. They're not, they've been around about a decade now. Patrick Murray, who runs the Polling Institute, is somebody I know. I had lunch with him right after we first started on this project. I told him what we were doing, and he was extremely interested in it from a polling standpoint. To make a long story short, he agreed to take on a testing for us on a nationwide basis. We first did it in New Jersey, had to decide how best you could administer roughly 5 personality tests along with your poll. So he has a lot of students, graduate students and undergraduates who are working at the Polling Institute, and they devised a platform so this could be done online. It was tested on telephone and other normal polling ways, but one of the more convenient testing devices and polling devices today is online polling. And so they devised a platform, and it takes about 35 minutes to do 5 personality tests along with providing information. It's all done anonymously. And so it's after successfully doing it with 900 people in New Jersey for a sample, we then went national. And from a pool of about 230,000, 990, just under 1,000 were again selected, from Trump lovers to Trump haters, the entire spectrum, and all being registered voters. We skewed it a little bit towards the Republican end and the excuse me, the Trump likers strongly or just favorably, to try to get a better understanding of the Trump base. And the polling was obviously something of a eureka moment for my collaborator because it confirmed his lifetime of work. It revealed, first of all, it also revealed some of my work, that the Republican Party has become the authoritarian party. It is led by social dominators. It is populated by both social dominators, right-wing authoritarian followers are the bulk of them, and then a staggeringly high number, and this is what really got my collaborator, of double highs, people who just tested and established this. So we have evidence now you could literally take to court and prove beyond question the nature and makeup of the Republican Party. That was to remind me to do it. I put that nice lady in because this can be done online and it's not particularly painful. the other striking fact about the poll results is we realize that Trump has probably created a coalition of the most prejudiced American base in American history. That was the dominant revelation of the fact not only are they authoritarians, they are highly biased. And there seems to be a very high correlation between authoritarianism and being prejudiced. So this was not surprising to my collaborator, but certainly confirming. So that's the background of the book, and I will be happy to answer any questions the professor might have.
Thank you, sir. So just to, as you were saying, to further elaborate with the book, I wanted to talk about how you talk about in the book the susceptibility of right-wing authoritarians to accept at face value the lies of an authoritarian leader. And you speak to how they almost feel like they're kind of like locked in, and how they feel almost like a puzzle piece where they're they owe it to their in-group to keep up with the belief system. With COVID-19 kind of decimating the economy and creating mass unemployment, and we've seen that there's been over 200,000 lost Americans in this pandemic. Do you think something as blunt as the pandemic would be able to loosen kind of the grip that it has on these kind of people? And if not, what does the data in your research provide to say that that's not the case?
We had finished a draft of the book when COVID-19 hit in March. I told Bob I'd done a book once on the Supreme Court about Nixon's process of appointing Supreme Court justices. And the book was released just before 9/11. And the book took years to become the bestseller it did because everybody wanted to talk about 9/11 after 9/11. I said, I think everybody wants to talk about COVID until we get through COVID. So we cannot do this book without including something about COVID. And we both thought it made a terrific example of the very point you make. Will this, something as serious and deadly as a pandemic, make people who are watching Trump, who are aware of the fact now that he lied to the American people? He told Bob Woodward, it's serious, it's airborne, it's a killer pandemic, but we're going to play it down. Which is exactly not what should have been done for the American people. You should have been honest with them and tell them what was going on. At least people who are not authoritarians, we assume, would want to know about this rather than to not be told. Anyway, we didn't have Woodward's information at that time, but we knew, in fact, most thinking people realized that the White House was not squaring with the public about what was going on. And we knew it was not going to disappear in days. It wasn't going to go from 15 cases to 0, and it was going to get worse. And the public health authorities were certainly forewarning us. So it made a perfect example we include in the book to show that these people are so locked in on their authority and so submissive to that authority that virtually none of them have gone anywhere since this has arrived. Trump's approval rating has always been between 41 to 45%. It's still there today. It goes up and down depending on the poll. This is basically who his base are these people who still approve of his behavior. To approve of his handling of COVID-19, you've got to go through all the processes we describe in the book of how people rationalize this, how their thinking is compartmentalized, how they will take the word of somebody like an authoritarian leader who says it's going to disappear and actually believe it. I was watching some comments from people at the Trump rally last night. I think it was in Ohio. And this woman was saying, well, you know, I believe what the president says. If it's my turn, if I'm going to get sick, and that's God's will. And I'm here to support the president. Well, that's how these believers are. They just don't want to question their authority. So the answer to your question is, it's not going to make any difference. There are a few people on the edge who were not as deeply authoritarian as some of the followers, who will, for example, when they learn they're prejudiced, they'll be unhappy with that information, and they will say, I don't want to be a prejudiced person. I don't want to be incapable of self-examination and critical thinking, and they'll try to deal with it. But these are few and far between. So our message in this book is that if you're unhappy with authoritarian leadership, if you like our democracy the way it was built with checks and balances, if you don't want a president who is demolishing all the norms, then don't try to change the mind of his followers, because you're not going to do it. The only way you can deal with it is because there's not enough of them to really control the government. They are a minority, and you can vote them back under the rock where they belong in a democracy, because democracy don't work with these kinds of people in charge. And that's the message of this book. We actually explain what they're going to do, how they can use techniques to suppress the vote, all the tactics that are there for someone like a Trump. In fact, one of the things we polled in the Monmouth polling was, how would they feel if Trump claims after losing that it's a rigged election and he wants to stay in power? Well, a surprisingly high percentage, depending on how you skew our poll or which elements of the questions you take, about 19 to 24% are okay with this. They'll tolerate that and let him get away with it and let him stay in power if he wants to. That sort of comports with those numbers I gave you from the democracy study at the outset, where people, they have really no trouble with authoritarian rule. There's about a third, crudely, of our population, not all of our voters, but Trump's followers, it's about 40%, have no trouble with his behavior, whatever he does.
And so to go back on the Monmouth poll that you were talking about, I remember I was reading it as I was reading the book. There was one thing that really caught my attention and almost kind of made my jaw drop, and because of the way that it kind of almost played out in real time over the summer. You had put in chapter 10 in the portion called Other Important Findings, specifically the line about stomping out the rot. With the events of Kenosha, Wisconsin kind of like in our peripheral, can you explain what the data showed you when you included that statement into the survey?
It was staggering, as you saw, how many people were willing to subscribe to that is something of a Nazi cheer, as we label it, to stomp out the rot. And that's why we put it in, just sort of a across the board test. And people who were just sort of on the fringe even came in to support that. So it was a pretty high number on the stomp out the rot. The data generally on the Monmouth poll, these are just notes to myself what I have up here. Just taking the groups that leaned, about 470 some people who either approved or highly approved of Trump, and they fall into really three categories. They're white males without a 4-year college education. They're evangelicals or born agains, or they're both evangelical and born again. Some of the religious right, define themselves and describe themselves differently. But you can see there the high approval rating they gave Trump generally. The white males without a 4-year were 73%, the evangelicals were 80%, and the born again and evangelicals were 88% approval rating. They're also, all of them went up in their prejudice. We had a separate prejudice test in the Monmouth test. Here, the most striking figure to me here is at the end, where you see how many of these people are double highs. 23% of the white males without a 4-year college education are double highs. The evangelicals or the born agains are 30%, and the both evangelical and born again are 36%. Those numbers are staggering. We also found in the data that the Republican Party is controlled by the double highs. And these people, double highs are really not suited for democracy, or at least not our kind of democracy. They're better suited for some other system. So it's a little terrifying.
And to kind of continue on that thought process, where exactly do you, because as you say, they have such a hold on the modern day Republican Party at this moment. Where do you see the Republican Party going should Donald Trump fail to gain re-election? I know that you talked about how they were, kind of flocking to this kind of like this authoritarian personality types, and I feel like I get the feeling from the kind of the major players of the Republican Party, they don't necessarily kind of replicate that kind of intuition that you talk about that Donald Trump possesses, in his ability to generate crowds and to kind of get that kind of passionate, rabid fan base that he possesses with these rallies. Where would the Republican Party go should he fail to win re-election?
I think what's going to happen, it's going to depend on how badly they are defeated, or if they, God forbid, survive and he's reelected, well, then it's Katie bar the door. If it's a tsunami election and he is washed out and they are all washed out and lose the House and Senate, which is the healthiest thing, then the Republican Party is going to re-examine itself. The people who support Trump, the authoritarian personalities who we discuss in this book, are going nowhere. They're going to be looking after Trump. Trump will be around, come what may, assuming his health holds up, and he will be some sort of formal or informal leader and voice for them for a long time. But you can be sure that right now there are people who have witnessed what Trump's doing and done. They recognize it for what it is, and they're plotting their own thoughts about how to become the next authoritarian leader. They are social dominators and probably double highs, and they're saying, well, I'm smart, a lot smarter than Trump. And Trump, Trump may have been good in business, or a good cheat in business and gotten by successfully. He has no knowledge of government. He just doesn't understand how it works. He doesn't have a good newspaper knowledge of the way Washington works. He has been a disaster. He hasn't hired anybody who can tell him how it works. He won't listen to anybody who can tell him how it works. And this has been his own handicap. So he only by learning the process, and the more he's learned, the more dangerous he's become, has he survived. And the Serpine Republican Party has kept him in power because his base is so solid. They're terrified of this 40 to 45% who he seems to be able to, through a Twitter account, direct them. A Mitch McConnell to all of them, Susan Collins, they all have just fallen in line because they're afraid of this base. They don't know how many of these people are in their districts. They've probably done a lot of polling now. They didn't know this body of science existed. And for a long time, nobody even recognized it was out there. I'm sure they all know it's out there now. And there's more polling going on, like we did with Monmouth, to find out who these people are, where they live, and how they respond. So where's the answer? Where's the Republican Party going? The election is going to determine that. If it is a washout, these people are going to be largely pushed back under rocks where they'll have very little influence. And the Republican Party, that is really the party of the Lincoln Project and the moderates, will come back in and probably try to rebuild the party. That was happening after Obama won. There was an assessment made where they thought how foolish it was to turn away people like Hispanics. And they were reaching out to bring Hispanics into the Republican Party. That was George Bush's and Jeb Bush's big contribution, that they thought these people should be a part of the fold and not outside the tent. Well, Trump has driven them all, virtually all but a few wealthy Cuban Americans and others, out of the party. So a lot's going to. This is clearly a major election for the future of the Republican Party and for politics in America. You know, whether our democracy is going to survive, that's what's at play. Authoritarianism is on the ballot, sadly.
And to continue, obviously, regardless of whether Donald Trump is on the ballot or is president again, that kind of base that he has cultivated for himself, they're still going to be around, as you say in the book. They're going to still be a voting presence. And as you were talking and describing, there is going to be someone who kind of learns the lessons of this administration and figures out a way to do in a more intelligent and kind of stealth kind of way to navigate the mechanisms of government to get kind of even more authoritarian results than this current president is trying to do. We go back to Richard Nixon, obviously your former boss, and we weren't able necessarily to fully get an understanding of his authoritarianism without the White House tapes. I would assume that the next person who this next social dominator that will attempt this kind of power grab won't have the kind of same mistakes that are committed by the 37th president of the United States or the 45th. How can the public safeguard against such future aspirations? And what would it look like when that kind of authoritarian kind of reach is not as in the open as it is with the current occupant of the White House?
Well, you're right in making the distinction between Trump and Nixon. Nixon was not a demagogue. He was an authoritarian behind closed doors. Nobody would have known of the degrees of his authoritarianism, but for his secret tape recording system that was recording what happened behind doors. Indeed, I'm somebody who was on his staff, and until I started having regular meetings, I didn't really sense it. And even in those meetings, I had some 39 meetings with him, which had proved deadly for him. The fact that we did have 39 meetings or conversations, I should say, because some of them were meetings, some of them were telephone calls. It wasn't really until I did a book where I went through all of his Watergate-related conversations, and that's when I realized the depth of his. It was a 4-year project where I'm listening to tapes. I realized how much of an authoritarian this man really was at heart. Something he didn't share with but his most trusted staff. So you might not know the next authoritarian who comes along, because he will be that, or not likely she, but more likely a he as a social dominator, will realize that we can't have another Donald Trump. We can't play this game and have people accept it. So it may sneak in and we won't know, but there are probably some pretty good cues. Nixon did bring a reputation with him. I almost didn't go to work for him because I was a little leery of his reputation as Tricky Dick, and he had had some ruthless campaigns before he got to the presidency. I thought he had mellowed out as a senior statesman, and I didn't realize until I assembled a lot of it until after it was all over, that he was ruthless, but for a rather unique cause. And Nixon actually, because of Trump, is going to start looking better. Nixon just believed in himself. He thought he was a peacemaker and could bring a generation of peace. But he thought to be an effective leader, you had to be ruthless. He said, this is a tough game. Wallflowers don't make it. You need to play on the world stage. You got to play as tough as the other guys that are out there. So that's why he in his own mind justified his ruthlessness. There's a little bit of that in Trump's unsophisticated ruthlessness, that he says he needs to be a tough guy because that's the way he'll win. But it just doesn't work in a democracy. As I say, Woodrow Wilson, Andrew Jackson, John Adams, all authoritarian social dominators, and varying degrees of obnoxiousness, you might say. Not all of them were demagogues, like, say, a George Wallace or a Joe McCarthy are pretty obnoxious people. I find Donald Trump pretty obnoxious. So I just don't like people who take that approach to life.
All right, and so to kind of wrap up my my questioning portion of this program, in the beginning of the book, you're hesitant to give a full psychological profile of the president, but given your research into the man and his followers, along with the journalism that we've seen in the last 4 years, and concurrent with the Mary Trump book that has recently come out, how does Donald Trump accept an electoral defeat? And is he capable of such a thing? And what do you think he'll react when that moment comes?
Well, we do deal with that somewhat in the book, and we addressed it in the polling, of course. How will he? It'll depend on the degree of defeat. If it is, as we say, what we think is necessary, a tsunami, he has no option but to accept it. He has finally become a loser, although he will blame everybody but himself, and he will never accept that he is a loser. He will, in his own private moments, know that what he was peddling didn't sell with the American people. Will he go away quietly? No, but he will go away if it's a tsunami, because he'll know he doesn't have a leg to stand on. If it's close, he'll be a threat right up until he is removed. And if excuse me, and if he's lost the House and Senate, that will be easier. And I think that's going to happen. It certainly will happen in a tsunami, but it'll likely happen either way. And then he'll be in trouble. If he holds on to the Senate and he wins re-election, we're in the last days of our democracy.
And so this wraps up my portion of my questioning. And so we have a couple of questions that we had asked for readers who wanted to ask you some questions over on Instagram. And so our first question comes from Julie, and she asks, what are the ramifications politically for radical groups such as QAnon and the Proud Boys under a Trump victory or under a Biden victory?
Well, under a Trump victory, they would find vindication, obviously, and they will grow and blossom under a Trump victory. As I say, democracy as we know it is over if Trump wins re-election. Yeah, under a Biden victory, they're back under the rock where they should be.
All right, and our next question comes from Jim. Given the constant comparisons to Trump and Nixon, can you elaborate on your relationship with him and what your thoughts were under the resignation that happened on August 9th, 1974?
Well, I've shared a little bit of that as we have gone along. I learned a lot more about him after I left. I didn't have, I was a mid-level staff person as White House counsel. So I wasn't dealing with the president, but infrequently and typically in group meetings and more in the form of exchange of memos and things of that nature that which would come from the chief of staff. So I didn't have a lot of personal dealings with him. The dealings I did have were delightful. He was always terrific with me, and he wrote nice things in his diary about me, how impressed he was and enjoyed talking with me and visiting with me and what have you. So it was a pleasant relationship, and I didn't enjoy doing what I had to do, but I was unwilling to lie. And so there was only one route to go, and that was to put it all out there. I tried internally to get my superiors to join me in doing the right thing, and that didn't sell. And then when they decided I would make a good scapegoat, they made a mistake, and then we were at war, and that didn't play out well for them. So it was a deep education. I had several high-level jobs in government. I was the chief minority counsel of the House Judiciary Committee at a young age. I was the associate deputy attorney general before I went to the White House to become White House counsel. So I understand how it all works. And I had more good days than bad days. And I think that we're going to learn a lot about Nixon as a result of Trump, that he will be viewed more sympathetically, if you will, and it will result in looking at parts of his presidency that probably should be examined for what they can teach us. It's good.
Our next question comes from Anna, and she asks, given Trump's fanning of political flames and his constant calling to his base to act out against perceived grievances and slights, should the country be prepared for outbursts and violence should there be a Trump loss come election day?
It'll again depend on the size of the loss. If it's a tight race, I think violence is more likely than not. If it's a tsunami, the losers, the sore losers, will not play well, and making the case that somehow it's been rigged will be virtually impossible. So there is a potential for violence. Trump has encouraged it, and he's created a context for it. He has an attorney general who seems willing to participate and facilitate violence. So I think people should be braced for it, for the worst case.
And our last viewer question is from Stephen, and he asks, with Richard Nixon and seeing him in a truly authoritarian manner, what are the ways in which Nixon's authoritarianism and his view of the presidency differ from Donald Trump?
Well, Richard Nixon was a much more sophisticated president than Trump. Nixon understood the presidency. He had been in the House of Representatives. He'd been in the Senate. He had been vice president. He'd actually, for several months, served as acting president when Eisenhower was ill. So he knew the machinery. He's trained as an attorney. He's argued cases in front of the Supreme Court. So he has a very sophisticated understanding of the presidency. He realized when he took over the presidency where the levers were and what powers were there to be exercised and how they could be exercised, how they could be used and abused, and he did both. Trump had none of that. He's come in and has really no idea. They could not find the light switches in the cabinet room when they arrived, and didn't hire anybody who knew where they were. So they obviously started with a tremendous handicap, and they've never really come up the learning curve to much of a degree. They've never hired people with much experience. Those who did have experience didn't last. The turnover of the White House has been ferocious. The corruption and criminality far exceeds anything that happened during Watergate, 3-4 times worse. And it's not over. It may yet get even much worse. So they're very different presidencies and men who have very different understandings. Nixon, I think, left because he actually could experience shame and did feel shame over what had happened, and that he'd gotten caught at what had happened. Donald Trump doesn't feel shame. He does not. It's not an emotion that troubles him, and that's very unique in our species. It makes it very hard to regulate somebody who doesn't know shame. So combined with his ignorance of how the process should work, he has no respect for institutions, whereas Nixon really respected the presidency and didn't want to do anything to damage the institution. Trump has no idea what that institution even is. He's never read any history, has no sense of institutional background. So, it's just, they're just very different men with very different attitudes. So that has resulted in very different presidencies.
Well, John, I want to thank you for joining us tonight. This has been a wonderful conversation, and I hope it is something that will serve voters well in the next couple weeks as they are making their decisions in regards to the election. The book is called Authoritarian Nightmare, Donald Trump and His Followers. You can purchase the book here at bookloft.com. And we also want to let our viewers know that John was very kind enough to sign book plates that will be added to copies of the book when you make your purchase. Thank you, John.
Thank you. Appreciate Bookloft sponsoring this, and look forward to visiting you when I'm in Columbus next time.
Absolutely. We look forward to having you here.